27 caregivers quit in 5 weeks. Not because the pay was low. The pay was 4 times what any home health agency in the Pacific Northwest offered for comparable work. Not because the hours were unreasonable. The shifts ran standard 12s with overtime built into the contract at time and a half. Not because the estate itself was difficult to reach, though the winding climb up Crestmont Drive did test the suspension of lesser vehicles and the patience of anyone unfamiliar with Portland's West Hills. They quit because the woman who lived at the top of that hill in a house worth more than most of their lifetime earnings combined did not want to be cared for. She wanted to be left alone. And when she could not have that, she settled for making sure every person who entered her home left it feeling smaller than when they arrived. The Blackwell estate sat behind iron gates that had not welcomed a willing visitor in months. 11,000 square feet of polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the Willamette River and the city below. The architect had designed the walls to capture light at every hour to pull the outside world in through panels so clean they seemed to disappear. But someone had drawn every curtain. Someone had sealed every room into its own private winter. The hallways ran wide enough to echo, and the only sound that traveled through them now was the mechanical hum of climate control and the muted footsteps of staff trained to be invisible. From the outside, the property looked like a monument to ambition. From the inside, it felt like a mausoleum where the body was still breathing. Jean Whitfield stood at the front door that Tuesday morning and watched the 27th caregiver walk down the driveway. She moved fast, a woman in lavender scrubs with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a phone pressed to her ear like a lifeline. She did not look back at the house. She did not slow down when she passed through the gate. She just kept going down the hill away from the building, and the woman inside it as though the distance between herself and the Blackwell estate could not grow fast enough. Jean had seen this exact scene play out so many times that it no longer registered as a crisis. It registered as weather. Predictable, cyclical, and completely beyond his control. He was 61 years old, built compact and square in the way that former Marines tend to settle into their later decades, and he had worked for Serena Blackwell since before the accident. His title was estate manager. His actual function was something closer to damage control. He posted job listings on medical staffing boards across 3 states. He screened applicants by phone, weeded out the ones who sounded fragile, and negotiated signing bonuses that would have been absurd for any other home care position, and then watched as each new hire came through the front door, composed and professional, and left through it shaking. Some lasted a day. Some lasted half a day. Number 23 had made it to lunch. Number 19 had not made it past the first medication round. Jean kept a small leather notebook in his breast pocket where he recorded each one. Name start date hours, lasted reason for departure. The reasons varied in their specifics, but not in their substance. Every single entry, if you stripped away the professional language and the face-saving euphemisms, said the same thing. She broke me. Jean closed the front door and walked back through the house toward the kitchen where the breakfast tray Serena had refused sat untouched on the counter. The eggs were cold. The toast had gone stiff. The juice had separated in its glass. He scraped the plate into the disposal and began the process of posting another listing, the same listing he had posted so many times that the staffing sites auto-populated most of the fields. He did not feel frustration. He had moved past frustration months ago into something flatter and more durable, a resigned proficiency that allowed him to repeat the same task without expecting a different result. He knew what Serena was. He had known her before the accident when she was someone else entirely, and he understood that the woman in the wheelchair and the woman who had built this house were connected by the same spine of iron will, the same refusal to accept any outcome she had not authored. The difference was that before the accident, that will had built an empire. After it, that will had become a weapon turned inward and outward, simultaneously burning everything it touched. Serena Blackwell had grown up in Bend, Oregon, in a house that could have fit inside the foyer of the one she eventually built. Her father was an electrician who worked commercial jobs across Deschutes County, a man who came home most evenings with copper dust in his hair and tape residue on his fingers. Her mother was the head nurse at St. Charles Medical Center, a woman who managed a staff of 40 with the same quiet efficiency she used to manage a household on a tradesman's salary. They were not poor. They were precisely calibrated a family that knew the exact distance between what they earned and what things cost and navigated that distance with a discipline that left no room for waste or complaint. Serena had inherited that discipline the way some children inherit eye color, not as a choice but as a fact of her construction. She had also inherited something her parents did not possess: an appetite for scale that Ben could not satisfy, and that her family's careful economy could not contain. She earned a full scholarship to the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania and graduated at the top of her class. She returned to Oregon at 24 with a degree that opened doors her parents could not have imagined and a vision for what Portland's underdeveloped waterfront neighborhoods could become. At 26, she bought her first parcel of land near the Pearl District with money borrowed from three separate sources, leveraged against projections she had built herself in a spreadsheet that ran 47 tabs deep. At 29, she broke ground on the Crestmont estate. At 32, she became the youngest woman to lead a publicly traded urban development firm, closing more deals in a single quarter than most developers closed in a decade. Magazine covers followed. Keynote invitations, a name that made boardrooms go quiet when she entered, because the people sitting in those rooms knew that Serena Blackwell did not enter a room she did not intend to own. She was not warm. She had never been warm. The people who worked for her respected her because she was fair and because she was relentless and because she paid better than anyone in the industry. She promoted based on performance. She fired based on results. She did not raise her voice in meetings, and she did not humiliate subordinates in front of their peers. But she did not ask about their weekends or remember their children's names or soften her expectations to accommodate anyone's comfort. She operated at a frequency that most people could admire, but few could match. And she had made peace with the loneliness that came with that frequency long before the accident made it permanent. Ethan Calloway was the exception. He was a structural engineer she had met on a development project in Lake Oswego, a man who understood load-bearing walls and also understood how to sit with Serena in silence without making her feel like the silence needed to be filled. They were engaged for 14 months. He moved into the Crestmont estate 8 weeks before the accident. His running shoes were still in the closet near the front door. Jean had offered to remove them 3 separate times, and 3 separate times Serena had told him to leave them where they were. Not as a memorial, as a boundary. Do not touch what is mine, even if it no longer serves a purpose. The accident happened on a Thursday night on the Pacific Coast Highway, 17 miles south of Lincoln City. They were driving back from a weekend property inspection on the coast, a piece of oceanfront land Serena was considering for a boutique hotel development. The details were simple and irreversible. A commercial truck crossed the center line. The impact was head-on. Ethan died on the scene in the passenger seat before the first responders arrived. Serena survived with a complete spinal cord injury at the T10 vertebra, permanent paralysis from the waist down. She was 33 years old. She spent 4 months in rehabilitation at Oregon Health and Science University and then returned to the house on the hill and closed the gates behind her. What Jean knew and what Serena had never told another living person was that she had been driving that night. Ethan had wanted to drive. He had a single glass of wine at dinner, a Pinot Noir from a Willamette Valley vineyard they had visited that afternoon. One glass. He was completely sober. But Serena had insisted on driving because she always insisted on driving. She controlled the route, the speed, the music, the temperature in the car. Control was not a preference for her, it was a compulsion. And on that stretch of highway in the dark, when the truck appeared in their lane with its headlights cutting sideways across the asphalt, she was the one behind the wheel. She survived. He did not. And the question that lived inside her like a second spine, rigid and unremovable, was whether Ethan would have reacted faster, whether his reflexes, unimpaired by the fatigue she had been ignoring for the last hour of driving, would have found the shoulder in time, whether her need to control everything, including the wheel of a car on a dark coastal highway, was the thing that killed the only person she had ever allowed close enough to matter. That question was the engine of everything that followed. The anger, the cruelty, the systematic destruction of every caregiver who walked through her door. It was not that Serena enjoyed causing pain, though Jean sometimes wondered. It was that the pain she carried was so concentrated, so compressed by guilt and loss, and the daily physical reality of a body that no longer obeyed her, that it had to go somewhere. And it went outward, into the people who came to help, into the voices that offered comfort she did not want and could not use, into every well-meaning professional who looked at her and saw a woman in a wheelchair who needed compassion because compassion required her to be a victim. And Serena Blackwell would rather destroy every relationship in her life than accept that designation. She had not built a billion-dollar company by being someone people felt sorry for. She would not rebuild her life that way either, even if rebuilding meant burning everything else to the ground first. Marcus Reeves pulled the delivery van up to the Blackwell gate at 11:14 that same Tuesday morning, 40 minutes after the 27th caregiver had walked down the hill and out of the story. The van was white, or had been white once. Now it was the color of neglect, a dented and sun-faded rectangle with the Greenleaf Meals logo peeling off the driver's side door in a way that suggested the adhesive had given up before the vehicle did. Marcus drove this van 6 days a week across Portland's West Hills, delivering prepared meals to clients who paid $45 for a single portion of herb-crusted salmon over quinoa or grass-fed beef medallions with roasted root vegetables. He had never eaten what he delivered. The math did not work for that. The math barely worked for anything. He was 36 years old, lean, in the way that comes from long shifts and skipped meals rather than discipline or vanity. His face carried 10 years it had not earned the kind of premature aging that accumulates not from age itself, but from the specific gravity of sustained financial pressure. He had grown up in outer southeast Portland, in a neighborhood where the houses were small and the lots were smaller, and the men who lived in them worked with their hands because that was what was available and what they knew. His father had been a roofer who died of a heart attack on a job site when Marcus was 14, collapsing on a residential tear-off in Milwaukee on an August afternoon while his crew stood around him and waited for an ambulance that arrived 11 minutes too late. His mother, Diane Reeves, had raised him alone after that, working double shifts at a commercial laundry facility in Clackamas to keep the mortgage current and the lights on. She never complained. She never explained the math to Marcus. She just worked, and he watched her work, and something in the way she carried it taught him that endurance was not a virtue you chose, but a condition you inherited, like the shape of your hands or the color of your eyes. Marcus had enrolled at Portland Community College after high school in the nursing program because nursing was steady work, and steady work was what Diane Reeves had taught him to value above everything else. He completed 2 years. He learned anatomy, pharmacology, the basics of patient care. He learned how to read a medication schedule and how to change a wound dressing and how to move a patient from a bed to a wheelchair without making them feel like cargo. He learned the specific angle at which you reposition someone every 2 hours to prevent the pressure sores that formed when immobile skin pressed too long against a surface. He learned these things in classrooms and labs, and then he learned them again differently and more permanently when his mother's spine began to deteriorate and she needed someone at home full-time. He dropped out of the program 6 credits short of completion and moved back into the house in outer southeast and spent a year doing for his mother what no textbook could fully prepare a person to do: changing her, bathing her, lifting her, sitting with her on the nights when the pain medication stopped working, and the only thing he could offer was his presence in the room, steady and unflinching, while she gripped his hand and waited for the next dose to build in her bloodstream. When Diane's condition progressed to the point where home care was no longer sufficient, Marcus found a facility. Cascade Recovery Center, a rehabilitation and long-term care facility east of Gresham, was not the best option available. It was the option his budget could reach. The monthly invoice was $4,200. Marcus earned $2,800 a month driving for Greenleaf Meals. The gap between what his mother's care cost and what he could earn was not a gap. It was a canyon, and it grew wider every month, filled with compounding late fees and collection notices and the particular shame of a man who knows the exact dollar amount of his own inadequacy. He had sold his personal car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and reliable transmission, and bought the van with what was left. He picked up every extra shift the company offered. He never said no to a delivery, regardless of the distance or the hour or the neighborhood. He ate whatever was cheapest at the corner store near his studio apartment. He had not bought new clothes in 2 years. He had not seen a doctor in 3. The bills were the thing that kept him moving, and the fear underneath the bills, the fear that one missed payment would cascade into a sequence of consequences that ended with his mother in a facility that was worse than cascade, was the thing that kept him from stopping. He punched the intercom code at the Blackwell gate that Tuesday and expected the usual sequence. Pull up to the service entrance. Leave the insulated bag on the step. Snap a photo for the delivery confirmation. Move on to the next stop. But when the gate opened, he saw the woman in lavender scrubs walking fast down the driveway, and something in the way she moved made him take his foot off the gas and let the van crawl forward at idle speed. She was crying, not the kind of crying that comes from sadness, but the kind that comes from something being stripped away, the wet and ragged breathing of a person who has just had a fundamental belief about themselves disproven. She passed the van without looking at it. She passed through the gate without slowing. She walked down the hill as though the act of walking away was the only agency she had left. Marcus parked near the front steps and got out with the insulated bag. Jean was standing at the door watching the woman disappear down the road with the practiced expression of a man who had seen this exact scene too many times to count. His face was flat, professional, the emotional equivalent of a cleared desk. Marcus handed over the delivery bag and nodded toward the road. The gesture was simple, just a tilt of the head in the direction the woman had gone, but it carried a question that Jean chose to answer even though he had not been asked. Jean's voice came out steady, the cadence of a weather report factual and detached and unavoidable. Number 27 lasted about 4 hours. The one before her made it to lunch. Marcus stood on the front step with his hands at his sides and listened. Jean did not usually talk to delivery drivers. Delivery drivers were part of the machinery of the estate, functional and interchangeable, and Jean treated them with the efficient courtesy he extended to all service personnel. But something about that Tuesday, about the 27th name, he would have to add to his notebook, loosened something in him that had been held tight for months. He talked, not because he was recruiting Marcus, and not because he thought a delivery driver had any relevance to the problem inside the house, but because carrying knowledge alone for too long turns it toxic. And Jean had been carrying this particular knowledge since the accident. He explained that the woman who lived in the house had burned through more caregivers in 5 weeks than most people encountered in a lifetime. They arrived qualified, composed, credentialed. They left shaking, some left crying, a few left angry, but they all left, and they all left for the same reason. Serena Blackwell did not just reject help. She studied the person offering it, identified their weakest point, with the diagnostic precision of someone who had spent a career reading balance sheets and competitor filings, and then she applied pressure to that weak point until the person broke. Jean paused. The wind came up the hill from the river carrying the smell of rain that had not yet arrived. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was not asking for help and not offering information, but simply acknowledging the existence of a situation that exceeded his capacity to manage alone. Marcus absorbed this. He did not respond immediately. He took the empty delivery confirmation photo, pocketed his phone, and walked back to the van. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. The dashboard clock ticked past 11:30. He had 4 more deliveries on his route, all of them time-sensitive, all of them to clients who would call the company and complain if their $45 salmon arrived lukewarm. He should have started the engine and driven down the hill and finished his route and gone home to his studio apartment and heated up whatever was in the cabinet and gone to sleep and done it all again tomorrow. That was what the math required. That was what the schedule demanded. Instead, he drove to Cascade Recovery Center. He did not make his remaining deliveries. He drove east on Highway 26 and then south on 181st Avenue and pulled into the parking lot of a low beige building that smelled like industrial cleaner and cafeteria food and the particular stillness of rooms where time passes differently than it does outside. He walked through the lobby and down the corridor to room 114 and sat in the vinyl chair next to his mother's bed and watched her sleep. Diane Reeves lay on her left side with her knees drawn up and her hands folded under her chin. She was 63 years old and looked 70. Her hair had gone white in the 2 years since she entered full-time care, and her skin had taken on the translucent quality that comes from living under fluorescent light. The invoice for her care was pinned to a corkboard above the bedside table. Marcus could see it from where he sat. $4,200. Itemized. Physical therapy, medication adjustments, specialist consultations, facility fees. Every line a number. Every number a weight. He sat there and did the math one more time, the math he had done 1,000 times, the math that never came out right and never would come out right, as long as he was earning $2,800 a month delivering food to people whose weekly grocery budget exceeded his monthly income. Then he thought about the number Jean had quoted. Not directly, not as a salary offer because Gene had not been offering anything. But in the course of explaining why 27 people had fled the Blackwell estate, Gene had mentioned what the position paid. The figure was specific and it was obscene, and it was more in a single week than Marcus earned in a month. He sat with that number in the vinyl chair next to his mother's bed and felt it settle into the same part of his brain where the invoices lived, the part that calculated constantly and never rested, and understood that desperation was not a feeling, but a mathematical condition. He drove home. He did not sleep well. The next day, he completed his delivery route without incident and then drove back to Cascade and sat with Diane again and looked at the invoice again and ran the numbers again. The answer did not change. The morning after that, a Thursday, he put on his own clothes instead of the Greenleaf polo. He drove to Crestmont Drive. He parked at the gate and pressed the intercom. Gene answered, recognized his voice. The gate opened without a question, asked about why a delivery driver was arriving on a day when no deliveries were scheduled. By the time Marcus reached the front door, Gene was already standing there reading the situation with the speed and accuracy of a man who had spent decades assessing tactical conditions. Marcus stood on the step and said it plainly without preamble, without the kind of verbal packaging that people use when they are asking for something they are not sure they deserve. I want to apply for the caregiver position. Gene studied him. The inspection was thorough and unhurried, the kind of assessment that former military men conduct, without conscious effort cataloging posture and eye contact and the condition of a person's hands and shoes. You have medical training. Marcus did not pretend. 2 years of nursing school, dropped out. Took care of my mother for a year before she went into full-time care. Changed her bandages, managed her medications, helped her in and out of the chair every day. I don't have a certificate, but I know what the work requires. Gene exhaled through his nose. The sound carried the weight of months, a long, slow release of accumulated futility. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was not pity and not admiration, but something closer to the way you look at a man who is about to do something difficult for reasons you understand and cannot talk him out of. Then Gene told him, "You don't walk in blind. Dr. Mitchell screens everyone. She's the rehabilitation physician on contract. If she clears you, I bring you in. If she doesn't, you drive home and forget this address." This was not how it had worked for the first 27. The first 27 had come through agencies with credentials and references and standardized skill assessments. But the first 27 were gone, and Gene Whitfield was a practical man, and practical men adjust their methods when the standard approach produces 27 consecutive failures. Dr. Claire Mitchell met Marcus in the physical therapy room on the ground floor of the estate, a converted guest suite that held parallel bars, resistance bands, and a motorized standing frame that had never been used. She was 44 years old, direct in the way that physicians become after decades of telling people things they do not want to hear. And she was the only person on the Blackwell payroll that Serena could not fire. Her contract was a medical services agreement that ran independent of the estate staff, and Serena's attorney had structured it that way deliberately back when Serena still trusted her own judgment enough to know she needed someone she could not drive away. Mitchell did not ask Marcus for his credentials. She asked him to describe what he had done for his mother. He told her about the repositioning schedule, every 2 hours. He described the way you check skin for the early discoloration that signals a developing pressure injury, running your fingers across the sacrum and heels and shoulder blades on, with enough pressure to feel the tissue beneath, but not enough to cause pain. He described the transfer technique, bed to chair, chair to bed, the way you position your feet and bend your knees, and let the patient set the pace so they do not feel like an object being moved, but a person being helped. Then Mitchell asked him a question about autonomic dysreflexia, using the clinical term without simplification, and Marcus felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the conversation and everything to do with the 6 credits he had never completed. He knew what the condition was. He had read about it. But the term arrived wrapped in the language of the program he had abandoned, and for a moment the gap between what he knew from experience and what a completed degree would have certified him to know opened up beneath him like a fault line. He could feel the edges of it, the old familiar shame of a man who had traded a credential for his mother's care, and who carried the absence of that credential the way some people carry a scar they cannot stop touching. He answered honestly. He described the symptoms and the response protocol in language that was accurate but not clinical. The language of a person who had learned the content without earning the vocabulary. And the difference between those two things sat in the room like a third person that only Marcus could see. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for several seconds, the kind of silence that a physician uses not to create drama, but to complete an assessment. Her voice carried the clinical neutrality of someone delivering a finding. You'll be supervised for the first week. I can pull you out at any time. If she gets a pressure sore because you missed a turn, I end it that day. Understood. Marcus understood. Mitchell left the room. Gene was waiting in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. She cleared you. Gene said it as a statement, not a question, because he had known Mitchell long enough to read her body language through a closed door. He walked Marcus down the long marble corridor toward the study where Serena spent most of her days. The hallway was wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, and it was empty enough that their footsteps produced a sound that bounced between the polished surfaces and came back to them delayed like an echo in a canyon. Gene stopped at a set of double doors and looked at Marcus one more time. Gene's voice dropped low, nearly matter-of-fact, but the warning underneath was structural. She's going to try to break you. That's not an exaggeration, and it's not a figure of speech. She will find the thing about yourself that you like least, and she will say it out loud, and she will watch your face while she does it. She does it because she can. She does it because it's the only power she has left that works the way she wants it to. Marcus did not respond. Gene opened the doors. The study was large and bright despite the drawn curtains elsewhere in the house. This room had its curtains open not as a concession to comfort, but because Serena needed the natural light to work by. She was positioned near the window in her wheelchair, angled away from the door, a laptop open on the adjustable desk in front of her. She did not turn around when they entered. She did not acknowledge the sound of the doors or the footsteps or Gene's voice when he introduced Marcus as a candidate for the open caregiver position. Her voice came from the direction of the window, low and precise, the voice of a woman who had spent years issuing directives in rooms full of people who earned their living by executing her instructions without delay. What agency? No agency. He's the delivery driver. That made her turn. The movement was controlled, a quarter rotation of the wheelchair, accomplished with a single push of her right hand against the wheel rim. She looked at Marcus the way a surgeon examines an instrument that has been placed on the tray by mistake. Clinical, dismissive, complete. She scanned him from head to toe. The worn shoes, the cheap watch with the scratched crystal, the jacket that had been washed so many times the color had shifted from its original navy to something closer to the gray of old pavement. She took in every detail with the speed and precision of a woman who had built a career on reading people and rooms and contracts and understanding within seconds what she was working with. Her mouth moved into something that shared the geometry of a smile but none of its warmth. A delivery driver wants to take care of me. She asked about transfer lifts. She asked about the difference between a stage 1 and a stage 4 pressure injury. She asked whether he knew what autonomic dysreflexia was and what to do if it presented. Marcus answered what he knew and said plainly when he did not know. He did not guess. He did not perform. He told her he knew how to read a medication schedule and how to help someone move without making them feel helpless, and how to stay in a room with someone who did not want him there. Then he said something that landed differently than the clinical answers, because it was not clinical at all. His voice was steady and unremarkable, the voice of a man stating a fact rather than making an argument. I know how to be in a room with someone who doesn't want me there, and I know when to be quiet. Serena's eyes stayed on him for 3 full seconds after he finished speaking. The assessment was not over, but something in it had shifted. The instrument on the tray was not the right instrument, but it was not dull either. She turned back to the window. 5 days. When you quit, and you will quit, don't bother saying goodbye. Leave the key with Gene. Gene handed Marcus a house key and a printed schedule. The shift started at 6 the next morning. As they walked back through the corridor, Gene spoke without turning his head, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry past the two of them. Gene's tone was dry, almost amused, but underneath it was something that might have been respect. She gave you 5 days because she thinks it's funny. She doesn't believe you'll last one. Marcus put the key in his pocket. The metal was warm from Gene's hand, and it was heavier than a house key should have been, or maybe it only felt that way because of what it represented. He walked toward the front door past the foyer with its marble floor and its high ceiling and the running shoes that still sat by the wall near the entrance, and he stopped for a moment and looked at those shoes. They were expensive. Trail runners with a brand name he recognized from the delivery routes, the kind of shoe that cost more than his weekly take-home pay. They were positioned neatly, toes pointed toward the door, as though the person who wore them had just stepped out and would be back any minute. Marcus looked at the shoes and understood something about the woman in the study that Jean's briefing had not covered. She was not just angry, she was in a kind of pain that did not have a medical code or a treatment protocol or a rehabilitation timeline. She was in the kind of pain that rearranges a person from the inside, and the anger was just the part of it that was visible from the outside. His hand was on the door handle when he spoke more to himself than to Jean, though Jean heard it from the corridor behind him. The words were plain and carried no particular weight in the moment, though they would carry weight later. Then she'll have something to be wrong about. He walked out through the front gate and did not look back at the house. The afternoon light was thin and gray, the particular gray of a Portland sky that cannot decide whether to rain, and the van sat in the circular driveway looking exactly as worn and inadequate as it had looked when he arrived. He had 48 hours before his first shift. 48 hours to read everything available about spinal cord injury at the T10 level wheelchair assistance protocols, skin integrity management, and the specific pharmacological needs of a paralyzed patient who was also, according to every available piece of evidence, the most difficult person in the state of Oregon. He drove home to the studio apartment in outer Southeast. He stopped at the library on 82nd Avenue because his phone screen was too small to read medical literature on, and he did not own a computer. He sat at a table near the reference section and read for 6 hours. He read about dermatomes and neurological levels of injury. He read about the autonomic nervous system and the ways it malfunctions when the spinal cord can no longer carry its signals correctly. He read about bladder management and bowel programs and the daily indignities of a body that has been severed from its own commands. He read until the library closed, and then he drove to Cascade and sat with his mother and told her he had found a new job. Diane asked if the pay was better. Marcus said it was. She asked if he would be all right. He told her he would. What he did not tell her was that the job required him to walk into a house every morning and absorb whatever a grieving, furious, paralyzed billionaire chose to throw at him, and that the only qualification he had for this work was a year of caring for the woman in front of him and 2 years of classes he never finished, and a tolerance for discomfort that had been built not by choice but by the accumulated pressure of a life that had never once given him the option of being comfortable. He did not tell her because Diane Reeves had spent her entire adult life protecting her son from the knowledge of what things cost, and Marcus had spent his entire adult life returning the favor. He drove back to the studio. He set his alarm for 4:30. He lay in the dark on a mattress that sat directly on the floor because he had sold the bed frame along with the car, and he stared at the ceiling and thought about the running shoes by the front door and the woman in the wheelchair and the number in Jean's notebook that would have his name next to it by the end of the week. 28. He would be number 28. And either the number would have a departure date next to it like all the others, or it would not. He closed his eyes. Sleep came slowly and left early the way it does for people whose minds are running calculations that do not stop when the lights go off. At 4:30, the alarm sounded in the dark apartment, and Marcus Reeves got up and got dressed and drove through the empty Portland streets toward the hill, where the house sat waiting, its windows dark, its gates closed, its hallways echoing with the silence of a building that had forgotten what it felt like to be lived in rather than endured. The first morning began in darkness. Marcus arrived at the side entrance at 5:58, 10 minutes before the printed schedule required because the drive from outer Southeast had taken less time than he anticipated, and because sitting in the van in the driveway of a house where no one wanted him felt worse than standing outside its door in the cold. The October air carried the mineral smell of the Willamette and the faint chemical sweetness of wood smoke from the houses farther down the hill neighborhoods, where people lit fireplaces for comfort rather than necessity. Jean opened the side door at exactly 6 and handed Marcus a laminated card without greeting or preamble. Emergency contacts. The name and number of Serena's primary physician. A list of things that previous caregivers had done wrong, printed in a font small enough to accommodate the volume of failures documented. The margins were full of Jean's handwriting additions that had accumulated over 5 weeks of watching qualified professionals make mistakes that seemed impossible to predict and impossible to avoid. Jean walked him through the morning protocol one final time. Breakfast prepared by the kitchen staff served at 7. Medication at 7:15, 3 prescriptions arranged by dosage in a small ceramic cup beside the juice glass. A physical therapy window from 8 to 9 that Serena had refused to honor for 3 consecutive months. But that remained on the chart because Dr. Mitchell insisted it stay there as a standing reminder of what recovery could look like if the patient chose to participate. Jean delivered these instructions with the compressed efficiency of a briefing, each item receiving exactly the words it required and nothing more. Then he stepped back and let Marcus enter the main corridor alone, which was itself a kind of test because Jean understood that the distance between the kitchen and the study was not measured in feet, but in the psychological terrain a person had to cross to carry a breakfast tray to someone who would use it as a weapon. The kitchen was warm and quiet. The cook, a woman in her 50s who moved through the space with the practiced economy of someone who had learned not to draw attention, had already prepared the tray. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, fresh squeezed orange juice, the medications arranged in their cup. Marcus picked up the tray and carried it down the corridor. His footsteps on the marble sounded louder than they should have, or maybe the house was simply so silent that any human sound became amplified. Bounced between surfaces that had been designed to capture light and instead captured every noise and held it. Serena was already in the study. She had positioned her wheelchair near the window at the same angle she had occupied the day before, facing the glass, her back to the door. Marcus set the tray on the desk beside the computer. She did not look at it. She did not look at him. Her fingers continued moving across the trackpad with a focus so deliberate and sustained that it could only be performative because no one scrolls through a document for 10 minutes without pausing, and Serena did not pause once. Marcus stood near the door and waited. 5 minutes. 7. 10. The eggs cooled. The toast stiffened. A thin skin formed on the surface of the juice. The medications sat untouched in their ceramic cup. She was testing whether he would fill the quiet with helpfulness, with prompting, with the kind of caretaker noise that 27 predecessors had made in this exact spot. Would he remind her the food was getting cold? Would he ask if she wanted something different? Would he hover or adjust or suggest? He did none of these things. He stood near the door with his breathing even, and he waited because waiting was something he knew how to do. He had spent a year in a bedroom in outer southeast Portland while his mother's pain medication took hold, sitting in a chair that was too small and too hard, watching the clock, and learning that the most important thing you could offer someone in pain was not a solution, but a presence that did not demand anything in return. Serena spoke without turning, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone issuing a directive she expected executed without discussion. I didn't ask for eggs. Marcus checked the printed menu Jean had given him. The schedule listed eggs for every weekday. The schedule was wrong, or the schedule was irrelevant, or the schedule was exactly right, and Serena was simply testing whether Marcus would defend it. She did not wait for him to check. I don't care what the schedule says. Take it back. Marcus took the tray to the kitchen, asked the cook to prepare oatmeal, and returned in 7 minutes with a new tray. Serena glanced at the oatmeal, extended one arm, and pushed the tray to the far edge of the desk with a single motion that combined dismissal and precision in equal measure. I'm not hungry. The words carried no emotion, no anger, no petulance, just the administrative flatness of a canceled meeting. Marcus picked up the tray. He did not argue. He did not let his face register anything that could be read as frustration or patience, because patience itself could be a kind of performance, and he sensed that Serena could detect performance the way some people detect a change in barometric pressure. He set the tray on the counter in the hallway outside the study and returned to his position near the door. Serena watched him from the edge of her vision. He could feel the peripheral scrutiny of someone who had spent a career reading rooms. She was waiting for the reaction she had been conditioned to expect. The tightening of the jaw, the controlled sigh, the countdown behind the eyes of someone calculating how many hours remained until they could leave. Marcus gave her nothing. He occupied the space near the door the way a wall occupies space present and structural and fundamentally indifferent to weather. The rest of the morning followed the same architecture. Medication time arrived, and Serena took the pills, but criticized the angle at which Marcus held the water glass, too close, too fast, as though she were incapable of reaching the last 6 inches herself. He adjusted. She told him to push her wheelchair from the study to the living room, and then told him his grip was wrong, that he was steering her like a cart in a grocery store aisle. He adjusted his grip. She told him to leave the room. He left. 12 minutes later, the intercom buzzed, and she called him back to move a book from one side of the desk to the other, a book she could have reached herself, and Marcus moved it without comment. She told him to adjust the thermostat. He adjusted it. She told him the temperature was wrong and to adjust it back. He adjusted it back. She asked for water and then told him the glass had a smudge and to bring another one. He brought another one. She drank half of it and set it down and told him to take it away. He took it away. Each instruction was a minor exercise in control, and Marcus executed each one with the same unhurried compliance, and the accumulation of these small exchanges created a dynamic that Serena had not encountered in 27 previous attempts. He was not resisting. He was not accommodating. He was simply present, doing what was asked, absorbing what was thrown, and returning to his baseline without visible effort, like water finding its level after a stone has been dropped into it. By the end of the first day, Serena had refused 2 meals, skipped the physical therapy window, and called Marcus the delivery boy 14 times each time, with a slightly different inflection, as though she were testing the phrase from multiple angles to find the one that would penetrate. None of them did. Jean found him in the kitchen that evening, eating a sandwich he had assembled from whatever the staff refrigerator contained. Bread, turkey, mustard. Nothing that required preparation or suggested he expected to be fed. Jean leaned against the counter and watched him chew with the evaluative quiet of a man who has spent a career assessing other men under pressure. Jean's observation was delivered with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything. Most of them cry by now. Marcus finished chewing before he answered, because his mother had taught him that speaking with food in your mouth was a failure of discipline rather than manners. And discipline was the one inheritance he had never been able to spend. His response was 3 words delivered without emphasis or defiance. I'm not most of them. Jean pushed off the counter and walked toward the door and stopped in the frame long enough to deliver a single additional data point. Day 1's the easy part. Marcus cleaned his plate and washed it and set it in the drying rack. He already knew. The second was Serena changed tactics with the decisiveness of a general who has probed the enemy's defenses and found them unexpectedly sound. On the second morning, when Marcus brought in the breakfast tray at 7, she engaged. Not with warmth, not with cooperation, with surgical precision. She asked him how much he earned delivering meals. The question came casually slipped between a sip of water and a glance at her laptop. Marcus told her the number. She asked if the van had air conditioning or whether that was an expense his budget could not accommodate. She asked whether his apartment had a dishwasher or whether he washed everything by hand in the sink like the rest of the working poor. And she used that phrase, the working poor, with the detached clinical interest of a sociologist examining a population she had studied but never inhabited. She asked whether he had health insurance and whether his shoes were the only pair he owned, and whether the watch on his wrist had cost more or less than the price of the salmon he delivered 6 days a week. Each question arrived with the calm precision she had once deployed in boardrooms to dismantle competing bids and expose the structural weaknesses in rival proposals. She was not angry. She was diagnostic. She was locating the nerve that would produce the response she needed, the flinch, or the flash of shame that would confirm she still had power over the dynamic between them. Marcus let her talk. He answered what he chose to answer and ignored the rest. When she asked about his income, he gave her the truth without embellishment. The number was what it was. When she mocked the idea of a delivery driver providing care for a woman whose net worth exceeded the combined property values of his entire neighborhood, he said nothing, because the only response that refused to feed what she was looking for was no response at all. And what she was looking for, Marcus understood, was not submission. It was engagement. She wanted the resistance that would allow her to escalate the pushback, that would give her something to push against the friction, that would generate the heat she needed to keep her anger burning at a level that felt to her like strength. Serena's jaw tightened. The muscles along her mandible flexed and held a micro-expression that lasted less than a second, but that Marcus caught because he had spent a year watching his mother's face for the involuntary signals that preceded a pain spike. Serena was not in physical pain. She was encountering something more disorienting. She was encountering a man who did not react because he had learned through years of carrying weight that would have broken someone with less practice. That stillness was not weakness. It was ground. That afternoon at 2:17, a silver Porsche Cayenne pulled through the Blackwell gate and parked in the circular driveway. Marcus was in the kitchen reviewing the evening medication schedule when he heard the front door open and Jean's voice in the foyer, formal and measured, greeting someone whose presence was expected but not welcomed. Marcus moved to the hallway and saw a man in a charcoal suit walking toward the study with the proprietary confidence of someone who believed the house he was entering would eventually belong to him. Jared Hollister was 48, trim in the way that expensive personal trainers and careful diets produce, with gray at his temples that looked intentional rather than natural. He had been the chief financial officer of Blackwell Urban Group for 6 years before the accident, a period during which he had managed the company's balance sheet with competence and managed his proximity to Serena with strategy. Jean had briefed Marcus during the morning walk through a compressed summary that contained no adjectives and needed none. Hollister had been positioning himself to assume operational control of the company since the week Serena entered the hospital. He had restructured reporting lines, renegotiated vendor contracts under his own signature, and cultivated relationships with 3 of the 5 independent board members through a series of dinners and golf outings that Serena, immobilized and isolated on the hill, had no knowledge of and no capacity to counter. Serena received Hollister in the study with the door closed. Marcus waited in the corridor. The door was solid oak, but the house was built for acoustics and voices carried through wood and stone with a clarity the architect had probably not intended. Hollister's voice was warm and modulated, the voice of a man who had spent years learning how to deliver unpleasant directives inside the packaging of concern. "You're not in a position to run things right now, Serena. That's not a criticism. It's a medical reality. The board needs stability. The investors need confidence. Let us handle the operational side. You focus on your recovery. When you're ready, everything will be here waiting for you." The words were polished to the point of frictionlessness. Each offer a velvet-wrapped subtraction, rest, recovery, the luxury of not having to worry. Serena did not respond. The silence from behind the door lasted long enough that Marcus began to wonder whether she had simply turned back to her laptop and dismissed Hollister without a word. But then Hollister's footsteps crossed the study floor, and the door opened, and he emerged into the corridor with his smile still in place, the expression of a man who interprets silence as capitulation. Hollister noticed Marcus in the hallway and assessed him with a glance that lasted less than a second, the glance of a man who categorizes people by their utility and finds most of them lacking. He walked past without acknowledgement through the foyer and out the front door. The Porsche started and pulled away. Marcus stood in the corridor and processed what he had heard. He recognized the tone. He had heard variations of it at Cascade Recovery Center in the voices of administrators and social workers who spoke to his mother with the same false gentleness, the same assumption of diminished capacity, the same underlying presumption that a person in a medical setting had forfeited the right to be addressed as a complete human being. And in that recognition, Marcus saw something about Serena that 2 days of insults and power plays had not revealed. She had not responded to Hollister with anger or dismissal. She had responded with calculation, not the defeated quiet of someone who agrees, the measuring quiet of someone gauging the distance between where she is and where she needs to be. For the first time, Marcus saw the businesswoman, not the patient. That night, the storm announced itself hours before it arrived. The barometric pressure began dropping in the late afternoon, a slow atmospheric exhalation that Marcus felt in his sinuses and in the ache that settled into his left knee, the knee he had twisted unloading a delivery van 2 winters ago, and never had examined because the copay exceeded what he could afford. By 7, the clouds had stacked themselves over the hills in dense gray formations. By 9, the rain was hitting the windows with a force that made the glass vibrate in its frames. Marcus was in the staff quarters reviewing the medication chart when every light in the building went out simultaneously. The air conditioning stopped. The security system went silent. The low electrical hum that formed the house's constant heartbeat dropped to nothing. Total darkness followed. Not the partial darkness of a room with its lights off. The absolute darkness that only exists in large houses on hilltops far from city lights during a storm that has blotted out the moon and the stars. He activated his phone's flashlight and moved through the corridor toward the main wing. The beam cut a narrow channel through the darkness. The rain hammered outside, and beneath it, Marcus heard something that made him stop walking and listen. A voice. Not calling for help. Not screaming. A single word repeated low and fast, almost involuntary. No, 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 no. He followed it to the study. The door was open. Serena was in the center of the room. Her wheelchair had stopped at an angle where she could not reach the desk or the wall or any surface that would give her hands something solid to hold. The motorized assist had died with the power. She was stuck in open space with nothing to anchor to, and something about that specific vulnerability had triggered a response that lived deeper than her anger and deeper than her control and deeper than the architecture of defenses she had spent months constructing. Her hands gripped the armrest with a force that turned her knuckles white. Her breathing was shallow and rapid, the respiratory pattern of a person whose autonomic nervous system has shifted into a threat response that the conscious mind cannot override. Marcus entered the room and spoke before he moved closer. It's me, Marcus. I'm going to push you to the desk so you can hold on to something solid. He did not ask permission. He crossed the room, unlocked the manual brake on the wheelchair, and pushed her slowly to the desk where her hands could find the edge and grip it. Then he pulled a chair from the corner and placed it across from her, close enough that she could see his face in the phone light, but far enough that she did not feel enclosed. He propped the phone against a stack of books, so the beam pointed upward and filled the space between them with a diffused glow. Serena's breathing decelerated. Her grip on the desk edge loosened by degrees. But her face was something Marcus had not seen in the 2 days he had been in the house. Not anger, not authority, something unguarded and raw, the face of a woman who had spent months reinforcing walls and had just felt them shake. She did not thank him. She did not acknowledge what had happened. But she did not send him away. They sat in the dark study while the storm raged, and the only light came from a phone that cost a fraction of what the furniture around them was worth. She spoke, and her voice was different, not softer, stripped, the lacquer of authority removed. The question was genuine, born from confusion rather than strategy. Why are you still here? Marcus considered his answer. The simplest layer was money. The next layer was his mother. Both were accurate, and both were insufficient. He chose the layer beneath those, the one that was harder to articulate and harder to dismiss. Because I don't see what you think I see. Her eyes lifted to meet his. The storm provided the only soundtrack. And what do you think I see? Curiosity for the first time. Not warmth, but genuine intellectual engagement. His answer came without hesitation. A woman in a wheelchair who needs to be pitied. But that's not what I see. I see someone in pain. Those are different things. Serena turned her face toward the window where rain streaked down glass she could not see through. She did not respond, but something had landed in a place that had been sealed shut and had found against all structural expectation a crack wide enough to enter through. Not a truce, not warmth, just a fracture in a wall that had been built to withstand anything. And for the first time since the accident, Serena let it stay. The third morning started differently. Marcus arrived at 6 and prepared the breakfast tray and carried it to the study, and Serena ate without complaint. Not with enthusiasm, but without the theater of refusal. She took the oatmeal and ate it and took her medications at 7:15 and allowed Marcus to push her wheelchair to the terrace without comment. Where hostility had lived, there was now a vacancy, and the vacancy was not warm, but it was not cold either. It was the temperature of a room where someone has just opened a window after months of keeping it sealed. Gene noticed. He said nothing. He had been around Serena long enough to know that naming progress was the fastest way to reverse it. That afternoon, a courier delivered an envelope. Gene brought it to Serena in the study. She opened it, read the contents, and set it face down on the desk. Marcus was near the door organizing the medication cabinet when he saw her face change. Not anger, not sadness. Something between dread and calculation. The envelope contained an invitation to the National Urban Development Summit, the largest real estate and development conference on the West Coast. Held annually at the Grand Atlantic Convention Center in downtown Portland, a building that Serena herself had helped redesign 4 years earlier. She had been a keynote speaker twice before the accident. The organizers wanted her back. They wanted her to talk about resilience. She received the word the way other people receive the word charity, with contempt wrapped in quotation marks. Jean pulled Marcus aside in the corridor and gave him additional context. Jared Hollister had scheduled an extraordinary shareholder meeting for the Blackwell Urban Group board set for 3 weeks out. The meeting date coincided with the summit. If Serena did not appear publicly, Hollister would use her absence as evidence that she was no longer capable of leading. The shareholder vote would proceed without her, and the restructuring Hollister had been engineering would become operational reality. The summit was not just an invitation to speak. It was the front line of a battle for control of the company she had built from nothing. That evening, Serena sat on the terrace watching the sun descend behind the West Hills. The sky was clear after the storm washed to a pale transparency that made the light feel provisional. Marcus was in a chair near the railing present, but not adjacent, close enough to respond, far enough to not intrude. She spoke to the sky rather than to him. There was a time when I walked into rooms and people stood up, not out of politeness, out of recognition. I built that, deal by deal, year by year, and now they want me to roll onto a stage and talk about resilience. Marcus did not talk about the conference. He talked about his mother. He told Serena that for 2 years he had worked double shifts to cover medical bills that compounded monthly regardless of how many payments he made. He told her about the months when the arithmetic forced a choice between rent and Diane's medication, and the weeks when sleep became a luxury. He said it without self-pity, just the raw data of a life under sustained financial pressure. Then he said something that arrived with the force of a thing that has been carried a long distance, and finally sat down. Not once in all those months did I take it out on someone else. Not once did I walk into a room and make someone feel small because I felt powerless. I carried my weight and I let other people carry theirs. Serena turned and looked at him directly. Not the clinical appraisal of the first day. A direct look. The look of a woman who has just heard something she did not want to hear from someone she cannot dismiss as unqualified to say it, because the qualification was experiential, and experiential authority cannot be revoked by credentials or wealth. She did not respond. She wheeled herself inside. But Marcus watched her shoulders release as she crossed the threshold, a physical unburdening that changed her silhouette, and he understood that something had reached her. A weight she was now carrying, whether she wanted to or not. The fourth morning, Serena did not call for breakfast. She did not press the intercom. She did not request medication. The study door stayed closed. Jean told Marcus she had not made contact since the previous evening. Marcus waited. An hour, 2. The house was charged rather than empty, the quiet of a room where a decision is being made. At 9:30, the study door opened. Serena wheeled herself into the corridor. Her face held an expression that occupied the narrow band between exhaustion and fury. Her voice was controlled but thin, pulled taut like wire under too much load. You had no right to say what you said last night. You don't know what it's like to lose control of your own body. You don't know what it's like to have people look at you and see a tragedy instead of a person. You show up with your story about bills and shifts, and somehow that's supposed to make me feel guilty for being angry. I earned my anger. I earned every piece of it. Marcus stood in the corridor and received it. He did not flinch. He did not lower his eyes. He let her finish. Then she said something she had never said to anyone. The words came out lower and rougher, excavated rather than spoken. I was driving that night. Ethan wanted to drive. He had 1 glass of wine at dinner. 1 glass. He was completely fine. But I had to be the one. I always had to be the one. And now he's dead and I'm in this chair because I couldn't let go of the wheel. The corridor fell silent. The marble floor reflected morning light in long, pale rectangles that stretched between them. Marcus stood with this new information and felt its weight redistribute everything he had understood about her. The anger was not random. The cruelty was not casual. She believed her compulsion for control had killed the man she loved, And she had decided that if her need for control had destroyed the best thing in her life, then she deserved to be someone no one could stand to be near. The anger was not a weapon aimed outward. It was a sentence she was serving. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his words carried no therapeutic intent because he was not a therapist. And the thing he was about to say came from the specific wisdom of a man who had spent years managing a guilt he could not resolve. You're right, I don't know what that's like. But I know this, if Ethan had been driving and the same thing happened, you'd be asking yourself why you didn't drive. Guilt doesn't need facts to survive. It just needs someone willing to carry it. Serena looked at him across the hallway and did not speak. Then she turned the wheelchair and went back into the study and closed the door. Marcus heard it through the wood, not loud, not dramatic, just breathing that caught and broke and caught again, the sound of a person crying who had forgotten how and was relearning it in private. She was crying behind a door she had not locked, and Marcus was standing on the other side of it, and the door between them was closed but not sealed, and that distinction mattered more than either of them could have articulated. The fifth morning, the last day of the trial period. Marcus arrived at 6. The house felt altered in some molecular way he could sense but not name. Jean told him Serena had not pressed the intercom once, had not called for breakfast or medication. 9:30. The study door opened. Serena emerged into the corridor. Her face was composed but not armored. The distinction was subtle and important. Composed was how she looked when she had chosen how to present herself. Armored was how she looked when she was expecting an attack. She did not repeat the confrontation of the previous morning. She looked at him with an expression that combined resolution and terror in proportions that only someone facing a long-avoided decision could produce. I'll go to the summit, not because of you, because Jared Hollister thinks I'm finished, and I am going to show him exactly how wrong he is. A pause. The next words cost her something visible, a tightening around her eyes. But you have to be there, Binoz. Marcus nodded. Once, he did not smile. He took the house key that Jean extended from the side corridor, the same key he had put in his pocket 5 days ago, and he put it back and he walked toward the kitchen to prepare the breakfast that the schedule listed because the morning needed a structure and the structure needed a beginning. And the beginning was eggs, 9:45, the same as every other day, except that every other day had been a countdown. And this one was a starting line. The days between the decision and the summit were not easy, and Marcus did not expect them to be. Serena still cut him when he moved too slowly with the chair. She still refused the physical therapy sessions that Dr. Mitchell prescribed. She still spent hours behind the closed study door. But she did not take back her word. Every morning she asked Marcus one question, is everything confirmed? Every morning he said yes. That was the extent of their communication about the summit. But other things shifted. Dr. Mitchell reported that Serena was allowing physical contact during medical assessments, permitting the physician to check her skin, take her blood pressure examine, areas she had previously declared off limits through the sheer force of refusal. Mitchell recorded these changes without commentary, understanding they were fragile. Jean began including Marcus in the logistical planning. They sat in the kitchen after Serena's evening medication and worked through details with the collaborative efficiency of two men who communicated primarily through tasks. Jean produced a leather notebook, once flipped to a page near the back, and showed Marcus the entry for number 27. Below it was blank space where number 28 should have been. Jean had written nothing. He closed the notebook, and neither of them mentioned it because what the blank space said was more than either of them needed to say aloud. The morning of the summit broke clear over Portland after 3 days of coastal rain that had kept the hills wrapped in fog and the river invisible beneath low cloud. Marcus woke at 4:15 before the alarm in the studio apartment that had begun to feel less like a place he lived and more like a place he stored himself between shifts. He showered, shaved with a razor that needed replacing, and put on the only dress shirt he owned, a white cotton button-down that Diane had given him 4 Christmases ago and that he had worn exactly 3 times since. It still fit. He paired it with dark slacks he had bought at a thrift store on 82nd Avenue 2 days earlier, spending $19 he could not spare on fabric that was not new, but was pressed and clean and would not embarrass anyone standing next to him in a convention center full of people who spent $19 on coffee. He drove to Crestmont in the black SUV that Jean had arranged through a car service because the delivery van could not be the vehicle that brought Serena Blackwell back into public life. Gene had handled the logistics with the operational precision he brought to everything. The SUV had been fitted with a wheelchair ramp at the rear. The route to the convention center had been mapped to avoid construction zones and steep grades. A private elevator at the Grand Atlantic had been reserved along with an accessible corridor from the loading dock to the backstage area. Gene had coordinated with the summit organizers through a series of phone calls that Marcus overheard from the kitchen calls, during which Gene's voice remained level and specific and utterly free of emotional context. He did not tell them that Serena was nervous. He told them the chair dimensions and the ramp angle and the time they would arrive and the name of the person who would be pushing the chair, and that was all because Gene understood that the difference between a dignified entrance and a spectacle was determined entirely by the amount of narrative that accompanied it. Marcus pulled the SUV to the front steps at 8:45. Gene was waiting. Serena appeared in the foyer at 8:50 in a charcoal blazer over a black silk blouse, an outfit assembled not for comfort, but for the purpose it had always served. This was the uniform she had worn to close transactions that reshaped city blocks, the armor of a woman who understood that in a room full of people making judgments about competence, the first judgment is visual, and the visual must be controlled before a single word is spoken. Her hands rested in her lap as Gene pushed her to the vehicle. Marcus opened the rear of the SUV and lowered the ramp, and Gene pushed the chair up and locked it into the floor mount. Marcus closed the rear door. Gene rode in the passenger seat. Nobody spoke. The drive took 22 minutes through downtown Portland on streets that Serena had helped develop, past buildings she had financed, and parcels she had acquired, and intersections she had fought the city to redesign. Marcus drove and watched the rearview mirror. Serena sat behind him, looking out the window at a skyline she had partially authored, and whatever was happening inside her stayed inside her. At a red light on Burnside, Serena's hand moved from her lap and touched Marcus's forearm where it rested on the center console. The contact lasted 1 second, maybe less. Her fingers against the fabric of his sleeve, a pressure so light it could have been accidental, except that nothing Serena Blackwell did was accidental. Then her hand returned to her lap. Marcus did not look back. The touch said what it needed to say, and what it said was not gratitude or affection. What it said was simpler and harder. I am afraid, and I am going anyway, and you are the reason I believe I can. They arrived at the Grand Atlantic Convention Center through the loading dock on the east side. Gene had timed the arrival to avoid the main entrance, where conference attendees were still filtering in with lanyards and name badges. The service corridor was concrete and fluorescent and smelled like industrial cleaning solution, and it was exactly the right entrance for a woman who did not want to be observed until she chose to be observed. Gene pushed the chair through the corridor. Marcus walked alongside. They reached the private elevator and rode it to the second floor. The doors opened onto the backstage area, a wide hallway lined with black curtains and cable runs. A stage coordinator met them with a clipboard and walked Serena through the sequence. Introduction by the summit chair. A 3-minute video package compiled from archival footage of Blackwell Urban Group projects. Then her cue to enter from stage left. The coordinator departed. The hallway emptied. Marcus could hear the auditorium through the wall, 800 voices layered into a single undifferentiated sound. But before the quiet could settle, a figure appeared at the far end of the backstage corridor. Jared Hollister, in a gray suit and a smile calibrated to project support, walked toward them with the measured pace of a man who had planned this encounter. He stopped 3 feet from the wheelchair and spoke in the warm, modulated voice Marcus had heard through the study door weeks earlier. You don't have to do this, Serena. Everyone will understand. I've prepared a statement on behalf of the company. All you need to do is sign. He held out a folded document in one hand, the gesture casual, as though he were offering a dinner menu rather than a surrender. The corridor was quiet. Gene stood behind the wheelchair with his hands on the push handles. Marcus stood to the side. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Serena looked at Hollister for a long time. Not with anger, not with the dismissive contempt she had deployed against caregivers. With something colder and more precise, the look of a woman who has identified a structural weakness in an opposing position and has decided exactly where to apply force. Then she spoke, her voice directed at Gene without breaking eye contact with Hollister. Gene, push me past him. Gene pushed the wheelchair forward. Hollister had to step aside. The movement was unhurried and absolute, the physical equivalent of a door closing on a conversation that was over. Hollister's smile collapsed. His eyes tracked Serena as she passed, and in them, Marcus could see the first flicker of a realization that had been months in coming. She was not finished. She had never been finished. He had mistaken her absence for surrender, and the mistake was going to cost him everything he had spent the last year building. Serena sat under the fluorescent lights after Hollister retreated and looked at Marcus. Not the clinical appraisal of the first morning, not the surveillance of the second day, not even the unguarded expression of the night the power went out. This was the face of a woman sitting at the edge of a decision and feeling its full weight now that the doing was imminent. Her voice was quiet, diagnostic. What if they don't see me? What if they look at the chair and that's all they see? Marcus did not offer comfort. He told her what he believed: some of them will. You can't control that. But you built half the skyline in this city from a desk and a phone, and none of that happened from your legs. So roll out there and remind them who signs the contracts. Serena held his gaze for a count of 3. Then she turned the wheelchair toward the stage entrance and did not look back, because a person who looks back needs one more moment of reassurance, and Serena Blackwell had never been that person and was not going to become that person now. The video ended. The summit chair introduced her, not as a survivor, not as an inspiration. As the founder and former chief executive of Blackwell Urban Group, one of the most influential development firms in the Pacific Northwest. Gene had written the introduction himself and submitted it with a note that any modifications would result in the speaker's withdrawal. The doors opened. Serena wheeled herself onto the stage. 800 people watched her cross 30 feet of open stage, and in those 20 seconds, the room went through a visible transformation. The polite anticipatory murmur faded into something quieter and more attentive. They had expected a speech about overcoming adversity. They were watching something else. They were watching a woman move herself across a stage with deliberate precision, and the wheelchair was present, but it was not the primary visual. The primary visual was the set of her jaw and the angle of her shoulders and the way her hands controlled the wheel rims with movements that were efficient and unhurried and fundamentally unconcerned with being observed. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone downward, waited until the room achieved complete silence. She did not open with a greeting. She opened with a statement of fact. She told them that for the past several months she had been the worst version of herself. She told them that after the accident, after losing the use of her legs and the man she was going to marry in the same night, she had converted her pain into a weapon and deployed it against every person who attempted to provide care. She told them the number, 27. Not because they were incompetent, but because destroying them was the only form of control she had left. She paused. 800 people did not move and did not cough and did not check their phones. Then she looked directly at the VIP section, where the board members and major investors were seated and where Hollister occupied an aisle seat with his expression arranged into supportive neutrality. She did not say his name, and to anyone who interpreted my absence as an opportunity, I want to be clear. I am still here. The company I built is still mine, and I will run it from this chair if that's what it takes. Hollister's crossed legs uncrossed. 3 board members turned to look at him simultaneously. Serena continued. Her voice caught once a half-second interruption where the words stopped and her throat constricted and her hand gripped over the edge of the podium with a force that turned the tendons in her wrist into visible cables. The moment lasted less than 2 seconds. She gripped and steadied herself and resumed, and the resumption was itself the content. She told them that losing the ability to walk did not mean losing the ability to lead. She told them the hardest deal she had ever closed was not a land acquisition or a zoning negotiation. It was the decision to come to this stage instead of staying behind the curtains of a house she had turned into a prison. When she finished, there was a beat of silence. Then a man in the 4th row stood. Then a woman near the center aisle. Then the standing propagated through the auditorium in a wave, and the applause that followed was sustained and unambiguous and loud enough to feel in the sternum. Serena sat at the podium and let the sound reach her. She did not smile. She did not wave. She stayed still and let it happen. The staying was enough. The staying was the statement. The weeks after the summit did not produce cinematic transformation. The curtains in the main living room were open for the first time, and natural light entered spaces that had existed in permanent dusk, but the light did not cure anything. It just made the rooms visible. Serena began taking calls. She reopened communication with the board. She reviewed project files that had accumulated on her desk in stacks Jean had maintained, believing she would come back to them even during the weeks when every available piece of evidence suggested she would not. The progress was not linear. There were mornings when she refused to leave the study, afternoons when she canceled every call. The anger came back in waves, smaller each time, but still sharp. Marcus learned their rhythm. Hard days he kept his distance. Better days he brought coffee to the terrace and let the quiet exist between them without requiring it to mean anything. 3 weeks after the summit, the extraordinary shareholder meeting took place. Serena participated via video from the study, Jean beside her attorney on a second screen. She presented documentation her legal team had compiled, evidence that Hollister had executed contracts exceeding his authorized signing limits, restructured vendor relationships benefiting his personal interests, and conducted board communications that selectively excluded information about the company's obligations to its founder. The presentation lasted 41 minutes. She did not raise her voice once. She presented numbers and dates and signatures and let the arithmetic do the work that emotion would have undermined. The board voted. Hollister was removed by a margin of 4-1. Serena retained operational authority, not by standing up, by being the most prepared person in the room, which was the thing she had always been and which the wheelchair had not changed. Marcus watched through the study door, which Serena had left open 6 inches. He saw the woman Jean had described from before the accident, sharp and focused, navigating the confrontation with tactical precision. When the meeting ended and the screens went dark, Serena turned her chair toward the door and saw Marcus through the gap. She nodded. Once. A small movement that the old Serena would never have offered anyone, because acknowledgement requires recognizing that someone else's presence matters. The following week, Serena announced the creation of the Blackwell Recovery Foundation, a private entity funded by a substantial allocation from her personal holdings, providing rehabilitation services, adaptive equipment, and long-term recovery support for individuals who had lost mobility. It was the first thing she had built since the accident that was not a wall. It was a door, and the door opened outward. When the foundation needed a community coordinator, Serena called Marcus into the study. She told him she needed someone who could sit with people in pain without flinching, someone who understood what it meant to carry a burden that was not yours and keep moving anyway. Then she said something that landed with the particular weight of words chosen by a woman who had spent her career choosing words for their precision. I'm not asking because you were kind to me. I'm asking because I watched you hold your ground when anyone else would have walked away. That's not kindness. That's character. And character is the only thing I've ever trusted that didn't let me down. Marcus accepted. The salary reduced the distance between what Diane's care cost and what he could afford by a margin that transformed the arithmetic of his life from impossible to manageable. But more than the money, the offer gave him a role that matched what he actually knew how to do rather than what a credential said he was qualified for. And the gap between those two things, the gap he had carried since dropping out 6 credits short, finally closed. Not because someone handed him a certificate, because someone saw what the certificate would have measured and valued it without requiring the paper. That weekend, Marcus drove to Cascade Recovery Center and walked through the lobby to room 114. Diane was sitting up watching a nature documentary. She looked at her son and performed the assessment she had been performing since he was 14, reading the truth of his condition in his shoulders and his step. Something in what she read made her turn off the television. He told her about the job, the foundation, the work it would involve. He told her more than he usually did because this was something he could describe without the careful omissions that had characterized every previous account of his life. When he finished, Diane asked a question that cut past every detail to arrive at the thing she actually wanted to know. Are you happy? Marcus thought about it longer than the question required because the honest answer was complicated and Diane deserved honesty. He looked at his mother in the room where she had lived for 2 years in the facility he had chosen because it was what he could reach, and he told her the truest thing he could assemble. I'm learning how to be. Diane smiled, small, contained the way she contained everything, but it reached her eyes and stayed there, the smile of a parent watching their child discover something the parent had already known. He drove back to the estate. Jean was in the kitchen. He had the leather notebook on the counter open to the last page. Below the entry for number 27, he had written number 28, Marcus Reeves, still here. And below that, in fresh ink, final entry. Gene closed the notebook and put it in his breast pocket. Neither of them spoke. The look between them contained the entire history of the past weeks compressed into a single moment of mutual recognition. Two men, different ages, different backgrounds, connected by the shared experience of refusing to abandon a woman who had given them every reason to leave. 3 months after the summit, on a morning in late January, when the winter light came through the estate windows at the low pale angle that only occurs in the Pacific Northwest, between storms, Marcus walked into the physical therapy room on the ground floor. The room had been converted from a guest suite and outfitted with parallel bars, resistance bands, and the standing frame that had sat in its packaging for weeks before Serena had told Gene without ceremony to have it assembled. Serena was already in the frame, standing, not fully, not independently. Her hands were locked around the support bars and her arms carried the visible tremor of muscles under maximum load, holding the weight of a body that had not been vertical in months. Her jaw was clenched. Perspiration tracked along her hairline. Doctor. Mitchell stood beside her, one hand hovering near Serena's lower back, close enough to intervene far enough to preserve the autonomy of the effort. Marcus stood in the doorway. He did not step forward. He did not extend his hand. She did not need encouragement. She needed what she had always needed and what 27 people had failed to provide. She needed someone to watch her struggle and see her. Not the chair, not the injury, not the biography of loss. Her. She caught his eye across the room. The winter light came through the window behind him and filled the space between them with the first real warmth this house had known since the curtains came open. Not metaphorical warmth, but the actual thermal output of sunlight passing through glass that had been uncovered after months of darkness. Neither of them spoke. Everything that needed to be said had been said. In a dark study during a storm. In a corridor on a morning when a secret that had never been spoken found its way out through a locked door. On a stage in front of 800 people who came expecting inspiration and received honesty. In a boardroom where a woman reclaimed what was hers. In a notebook where a man who measured everything wrote 2 words that measured the only thing that mattered. Serena Blackwell had built skyscrapers. She had reshaped city blocks and turned empty parcels into landmarks. But the hardest thing she ever built was the willingness to let someone stay. The willingness to stop punishing herself for a night on a coastal highway that she could not undo and would carry for the rest of her life, not as a sentence, but as a scar. Which is a different thing because a sentence has an end date and a scar is permanent, but does not have to define the body it marks. And Marcus Reeves, who had spent years delivering meals to doors that never opened for him, who had driven a van with a peeling logo through neighborhoods where the houses cost more than his lifetime earnings, who had dropped out of school and sold his car and eaten the cheapest thing on the shelf and carried a debt he could not resolve, and a love for his mother that organized every decision he made, had found a door that opened. Not because he knocked harder than anyone else, not because he was kinder or braver or more qualified, because he was still standing there when it opened from the inside, because he had learned from a woman who worked double shifts at a commercial laundry and never once complained about the weight of her own life, that the most important thing you can do for someone in pain is not to fix them or save them or show them the way out. It is to be in the room, steady, present, undiminished, and to still be there in the morning.